Jonathan Herron here with your 2021 Fearless podcast. Aren't you thankful and excited that we are finally in the year 2021? We've escaped that dumpster fire known as 2020. I remember New Year's Eve sitting there excited, watching Ryan Seacrest do the live New Year's Eve countdown. And there's two things that stood out to me as a leader. Number one, Ryan Seacrest says the exact same phrase on New Year's Eve every 7 minutes. Seriously, it's on live TV. He's trying to kill time. And every 7 minutes, Ryan Seacrest would look down at his watch and then look at the camera and say, "And what a year it's been." The second thing I realized on New Year's Eve is that once the ball fell and everybody was excited, we went to bed, we woke up the next day, I noticed that nothing magically changed. In 2021, as leaders, we are still faced with the same challenges and disruptions. We have COVID continuing to slow things down. Everybody's dealing with crazy political season, racial unrest. There's things in our society that need fixing. And as leaders, we have an opportunity to step up to the plate in 2021 to restore, revamp, and relaunch our organizations and churches. So speaking of which, I'll go full disclosure, like you, 2020 was like being a hemophiliac in a razor factory. Seriously, you may know me as the guy that leads one of the fastest growing churches in America, 7-year-old Life Church, Michigan. But I think in 2020, we became the slowest growing church in America. Seriously, we have hit the wall since March. Pivoting to online worship, the ups and downs, seeing how every church in America had a huge decrease in charitable giving. We were so thankful that the federal government gave out those PPP loans, the forgivable loans that allowed you to keep paying your staff and paying the electric bill. But when our PPP ran out last summer and we had to furlough staff, well, that's when some stuff hit the fan. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce you to my guest today on episode 46 of the Fearless Podcast. It's returning guest, Dr. Warren Bird. This guy has more degrees than Fahrenheit. He's probably the foremost expert on church and organizational health in the United States. Plus, he's a super nice guy. Dr. Warren Bird has authored or co-authored over 30 books. He is currently the research director at Leadership Network. He's also the vice president of research and equipping at the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. And today, Dr. Bird is going to pull up a chair and talk about what he's seen from a Google zoom out from 500 feet above, what is happening in the worlds of organizations and churches in the post-COVID era. Plus, in full transparency, I took advantage of the time with Dr. Bird to seek his wisdom and his advice on the challenges that I'm facing as a leader of a church here in Michigan. So do yourself a favor, grab a notebook, a strong, bold cup of coffee. Let's dive in. It's time for episode 46. I'm Jonathan Herron, a guy from Iowa who married his high school sweetheart and adopted 5 amazing kiddos. 7 years ago, I started a new modern church from scratch that is now the 11th fastest growing church in America. I also wrote a best-selling book on using principles of comedy and leadership, and along the way, I've discovered a passion for helping ordinary people jumpstart their lives and fearlessly chase their dreams and purposes in life. So each week, I'll be sharing insanely practical advice and inspiring interviews to help you jumpstart your life and become fearless. These are the tools to change your life. This is the Fearless Podcast. So here now you're in New Jersey area, right?
Metro New York City, yes. I'm technically in New York, yeah.
Okay. So here in Michigan, I don't know how it is in New York, but our governor has been very proactive in shutting things down since March. Like right now, you can't eat in a restaurant. There's all the high schools, all the colleges are closed, all remote learning. I have 5 kids. And so even as parents, yeah, yes, we are big into adoption. Your 6th kid is free. They punch a card. My wife and I were just crazy enough to, read the book of James and believe that it's our responsibility to care for orphans.
Neat. So
we're
seriously, are all 5 adopted?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, our oldest just turned 14. Our youngest is 2. And so
2 to 14 and 3 in between. Wow.
Which means our house is always a mess and our cupboards are always bare because they're eating all our food.
Yes, and you're forever buying new shoes.
Yes. Oh, yes. But I love hand-me-downs. We are big about that.
Well, you might love them. The question is, does child number 5 love them?
That's right. So we've been navigating the family side and the church side. And our experience has been lots of fear in the air here in Michigan. So it's translated for us into decreased charitable giving. And even when we've reopened our doors, attendance wise, it's mostly all online or people who've just tuned out. So we've been navigating all that. And then on top of all that, we had I don't even know what to call it. We had a staff mutiny, which is funny because when you're the lead guy, you don't even realize that it's happening until afterwards when you look back. But we had our entire paid staff all quit over the summer. And then we just figured out they are trying to start a church down the street. But the best that our board of directors can figure out is that the dominoes hit when we had to furlough staff in the summer after our PPP ran out. That's when they all jetted. So it was something that was building up, apparently.
Was there any grain of truth in their criticism that you can learn and grow from?
Oh, of course. Of course. Yes, absolutely. And that's, my wife and I are always wide open to correction and, knowing that we have blind spots big time. But all that said, they gave no notice, went on social media and said horrible things about me and the church and, all the bad stories that you can think of, all that kind of stuff. And so on top of COVID, when you ask about my 2020, my wife and I and our board of directors, we've been navigating, they think they're church planters, but they're really church splitters. So it's been a crazy year. And yet I can see God's hand in all of it and see how this is for my sanctification, and that there's things I need to change and to learn from in the midst of all this.
Wow, but that's got to be hard when you're fragile in the sense of a new church, and you have a pandemic on top of it with its financial impact. And, reputation grows inch by inch, but can plummet in seconds.
Yeah. No, we've always had the approach of we'll meet with anybody one-on-one in person, but we won't do meetings by text or, I don't need to defend my reputation online. That's not my job. So we haven't gotten into the mudslinging. So now we're at a place where things have quieted down. Praise God. And for us, I see it as a huge opportunity. We can, like many churches, it's almost like relaunching as we slowly come out of this pandemic.
Well, and frankly, every church is going to have to relaunch coming out of the pandemic, and will actually probably have to relaunch multiple times, because the pandemic's not just going to, unless God does an absolute miracle, it's not just going to end one day and you go, oh, that was over, now we're ready to relaunch. But you're going to have to do it, the soft opening, the grand opening, the public opening, the any number of different tags to do the same thing over, to take whoever's there and say, okay, now let's grow from this point. Let's launch from this point.
So from your perspective, Dr. Bird, from a national zoom out of the North American church, what are the trends that you're seeing right now for the average American church goer? Because the stats that I've seen may not be, they're in wet cement. Do we have consumer Christianity
well
in full throttle, or?
As an analogy, Ed Stetzer has a metaphor that I think is very helpful, that he said, and this is pre-pandemic, that in previous years, 75% of America identified with Christianity in some ways. Now, in reality, only 25% were biblical, church-going, put Christ first in everything people. And the other 50% were cultural Christians, willing to say, yeah, I think the church, whatever the church believes, if they teach that lying is wrong or other kinds of morality, that's probably my morality too, even if my heart isn't fully there. So in recent years, that middle 50%, and the remaining 25% were an atheistic, agnostic, secular approach. So you had 25%, 50% in the middle, and then another 25%. That 50% in the middle has shifted in recent years to more align with a mainstream secular morality. And so it's felt like, for many Christians, as public morality and biblical morality have sort of parted ways and clash with each other even, it's felt like there's been a widespread exodus and rebellion. But in reality, it's just the uncommitted cultural middle moving more away from biblical Christianity, more to a secular perspective. And likewise, the pandemic is accelerating the forks in the road within the church. Those who were actively engaged in a church and were trying to put Christ first in everything in how they live their lives, unless there's been a really bad experience in that church, they're still, what do we need to do to make this work? If we need to watch online, if we need to go with mask on, we'll do all that. It's the marginal or less committed or more spectators who have said, okay, I did this online thing, but I can't do that every week. And the missing ingredient there has been the relational connections for people to engage with. So those churches, most churches figured out quickly how to make a pivot to online services. But there were several other pivots, to use the word of the year, that had to happen. Yes, you had to pivot your online giving to make that easier. But more importantly, you had to pivot to a healthy, vibrant group life within the church, where there are connections, whether it's small groups meeting online or pastors and other leaders regularly phoning the unconnected people in the congregation. But the relational connection, if it didn't get rebuilt during the pandemic, they're in trouble and will be in trouble emerging out of the pandemic. And in fact, just yesterday, I was meeting with the church staff, and we went through a few diagnostic questions of not the people of the church, but the leadership that affects the people of the church. So let me just voice a few of those questions, and because I think they're relevant to your question. Do we have more people connected to small groups online or in person in 2020 than in 2019? Do we have more volunteers in 2020 than in 2019? And you say, now, wait a minute. I had, ushers, greeters, children's ministry workers. Okay. Maybe you can do those only on a small scale, but do you have online greeters for your online service? Do you have digital people helping, come up with the graphics for your online events? I mean, there are any number of new volunteer roles that can happen during the pandemic to engage people, because if people aren't engaged, then that affects their giving, their inviting of others, their walk with the Lord, and any number of other aspects of their spiritual life. So sadly, too many churches have shifted their paid staff to becoming camera operators and video editors, and it's become the pastors doing the work of the ministry. So I had a few other questions that I asked this staff, but I think those two highlight the shift the staff has to make in order for the people of the church to engage and keep growing.
So what do you see in 2021 for the American church? I mean, this is so unprecedented. You talk about the idea of restarting, relaunching, and even that is in different phases. Like if I'm just a normal pastor tuning in and I'm saying, where's all the sheep? What's going on? What do you foresee in the next 12 months?
Okay, so the question, where's all the sheep, implies a Sunday morning attendance model. If we open the building, they will come. Mm-hmm. And that model, which was on the decline, the pandemic has greatly accelerated its shift. The operative, where's the sheep, is, well, how are the sheep being discipled and engaged? Are you working with lay leaders who are in turn working with either lay leaders or volunteers? Is the whole church networked? Think of Exodus 18 and Moses and the manageable span of care, where Moses was trying to take care of, 1 million people. And his father-in-law Jethro says, what you're doing isn't good. Go talk to your God. But it sure seems to me that you're exhausted and they're frustrated, among other things. What you maybe should do is break everybody up into manageable spans of care. And then their needs will be met spiritually, and you'll have time to give overall leadership to the movement. And that same principle applies today. If some pastors have just delighted in becoming video preachers without the idea of but how am I connecting? What are the responses? See, when you're in person, you can say, so if you want to receive Christ today, raise your hand. Or if you're going to make a commitment to this new emphasis in the church, I want you to meet after the service. Well, there are digital equivalents to all of that. We have a new here bag for people who come in person. Do you have a new here kit or experience for those that are online? So what really to count? In the old model, we wrongly counted people in pews or beanbag chairs or whatever it was, and in our minds said that must be people being discipled. And in the in-person world, we should have counted other things just as importantly. Who's in a relationship through a group or team, who is growing in those ways, and how are we feeding the leaders of those groups? Well, that latter perspective of seeing the church not as a gathered bunch of faces, hopefully listening to my great sermons, which I hope they are great, and I hope they continue to be great. But the online, it's all the more important to say, so how do I give opportunities to respond? I've just preached on anxiety. Can we have a 3-week teaching on how to cope with anxiety that's in a small group format, and invite you as a follow-up from the sermon series to join that series? Any number of ways to keep inviting. Every digital sermon, well, every physical sermon probably would have been wise to end up with a call to action. But now, absolutely, our digital messages need to have a clear, how are we, what can I invite you to do and become in a way that we can have relationship or dialogue about in helping you in the process. So if where are the sheep has just translated into, I put my sermons online and the sheep can see it, and we've simply transposed the physical experience into a televised experience. I fear anyone with that outlook is going to be sorely disappointed that indeed you haven't been making disciples as you had hoped during the pandemic.
I was reading, somehow I ended up in Crane's business online. And there was an article about a week ago talking about how the pandemic has accelerated the American mall closures. And that in the next 5 years, the estimate is that 80% of American malls will be shut down because everything's gone online with shopping. Do you see that translating also to the American church, that with the pandemic, it's accelerating what was already in the forecast? And what do you see? Because when I was in seminary 20 years ago, and there was nothing about what do you do when there's a plague? How do you do discipleship when you can't be face to face?
Well, let me respond to that, but then let's talk about Life Church, and let's see, what are you doing and what's working and what's not working. But for me to buy something online, which says I'd rather make a purchase by clicking it rather than going to Costco, Home Depot, whatever, and touching it, that's a thing that I am buying. It's not a relationship. We are fundamentally social creatures. We want to be with other people. And if all of life was completed by me ordering food from Grubhub, and then I'm going to order my clothes, for tomorrow, from Amazon, I'm going to do this and that, life would very quickly become empty. So there's not a pure or direct parallel between the decline of the shopping malls, which is, I agree with, and people not wanting to be together with each other. Now, churches may end up with new forms, but the people face to face is what we're going to gravitate to. Yes, the younger you are, the more you tend to be millennial and Gen Z, the more likely you are to blend the two, just to, confirm your appointment by text message and use all kinds of electronic means to support your relationships. But there's still the piece, unless you're an extreme introvert, is I'd love to at some point in this be in the room with you or the party with you or anything that's face to face or as close a proxy as possible. So let's talk about Life Church. What have you done in the last months to engage people in community, and what's worked? You're there in Michigan, so you've got certain givens of what legally you can and cannot do, and more importantly, the legal things influence people's comfort zone and fear factors. So you've had to navigate that. You've perhaps had to preach about the role of fear and trusting God and all. But talk about the connections that you've tried and the ones that are working.
Sure. What's worked for us is the one-on-one phone calls, the handwritten cards, because we can't really go to people's homes. So those high touch moments have been really, really powerful. Where we've had challenges, and this is related to our second layer of challenge this year, is in the small group format, because part of that exodus as September and then October went is you would see a small group leader make an exodus and then they take their group with them. So I led a group through Zoom and that went really, really well. My wife led a group.
Which in a certain way speaks about the power of relationship, that it's the relational connection that triumphs over other things. So keep going.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. So no, as far as like the Zoom online groups, they were successful with those who have stayed with Life Church. But you're exactly right. You would see if one person turned, you would see the dominoes fall in that group. It was all relationally connected. And then as a pastor, it's so frustrating because it's like, how do you swoop in and, I don't know if rescue is the right word, but how do you?
It's a hard tension because the leader is not taking them to hell. The leader's just taking them to another church. So it's like, okay, I'm still going to see them in heaven, but I thought I had a shepherding role with them. I guess I don't anymore, but I'll have to have a shepherding role with other leaders then.
So what is, and maybe this isn't a very good question to ask, but what has worked well with like at Liquid, where you've got the online messages? Has the small group structure, has it remained strong, or has that been a challenge?
Okay.
Because I know we have the same sense of humor and ministry outlook, so I'm trying to gauge where we can strengthen and just trying to figure out where do you go in 2021?
Okay.
When
those
your leadership's been gutted.
For those listening, Liquid Church is not a bar, but a church built on the John chapter 8 idea that Jesus is the water of life and that coming to him is spiritually refreshing, just like receiving a drink in a parched desert. Tim Lucas is the lead pastor, and he and John Herron met each other at the outreach summit of the 100 fastest growing churches, and I had the privilege of helping write Liquid's story into a book called Liquid Church, very cleverly, with subtitle Six Powerful Currents to Saturate Your Community for Christ. And it's built on the idea that outreaches from the church, and these are the six that God seems to be blessing for Liquid. Maybe some of them might work for other churches or could be adapted to other churches. Now, the small group idea, to my two questions earlier, are there more small groups in 2020 than 2019 at Liquid Church? Yes. And let me give you a couple of examples. First, what I had thrown to you a few minutes ago about stress and anxiety groups, they've offered a bunch of short-term groups like that, and they filled within hours of them being announced each time. I think they're on their third wave of them now, that people are looking for a safe place to navigate all of this anxiety and stress and perhaps unhealthy outworkings like, my drinking habit or drugs or anything else, or yelling at my kids or my wife or my husband are outworking out of it. So that's been one. Another approach to their small groups is they thought, okay, people are binging on Netflix, so let's have them binge on Jesus. So there is a TV series called The Chosen, which is a modern day recreation of the lives of Jesus's, not just the 12, but the Marys and Marthas and others that are surrounding Salome that you hear mentioned, and staying with as many Bible lines as possible. They've tried to build backstories around each of those people. And so the idea was, folks, watch this segment this week on your Netflix binging, and even wearing a t-shirt that says binge Jesus. and then Sunday, we're going to preach on one of the biblical themes that come out of that particular episode. And then we're going to have a small group experience where you can talk about that particular online episode. And so that had a huge response. More than half of what the normal pre-pandemic church attendance were involved in one of the chosen small groups. I think the lesson I'm learning from Liquid and other churches is you just have to keep setting up new experiences with community and helping existing community to find creative ways to meet. Example, Sunday night, my wife and I went to a church, normal sized church, and they had 5 small groups in the church, each of which they have a church building, so they had a parking lot, and they had 5 fire pits, and each small group, masked, gathered around their fire pit, and they were kind of in a big semicircle. And then you had someone doing music outside, and we sang Christmas carols and silly things, and we ended, one of the ending songs was the 12 Days of Christmas in each different group. And there was actually a car section for people that didn't feel comfortable enough to get out of their cars because of the pandemic. And so they came and they'd done the sound so that by local FM transmitter level, you could tune into a certain channel, hear the song. So they were 11 pipers piping, and they would beep the horns of their car for when we got to that segment of the song. So here's an example of a safe way for small groups to gather in person that the church helped facilitate and invite, and yet it helped build community. And yes, a number of people brought friends as a first-time visit to experience this particular church. So that's yet another way that small groups are expressing themselves, that in this case, existing small groups, during the pandemic. So leaders, if you haven't been reading books about healthy small groups, this is a great time to do it. In fact, I just wrote an endorsement for one that just came out in recent weeks by Ryan Hartwig, Hartwig, on something about small groups. So if you need a small group book, give that one a try.
That sounds great. So what are some of the things that you think would be helpful with what's happening here at Life Church? Like, well, you're the doctor, I'm the patient.
Let's talk about your video services. Now, I'm going to guess that if we use a stoplight analogy, you've got certain green people in the sense that they're go, and they're like, Pastor, I know I have to wear the mask and all, but I really feel comfortable. What can I do for your in-person gatherings? And they're front line for that, and they'd love to be the greeters, masked or whatever, for the in-person services. You likewise have red people, stoplight color that says, let's stop. And they're like, I'm not ready, or I have an immunocompromised situation, or I have a family member, or for whatever reason, I'm not doing the in-person yet. Do you have volunteer roles for them as well? And just as for your greeters, do you have a lay team leader for the greeters? Do you have a lay team leader for your online greeters or graphic arts people, or whatever you've mobilized volunteers for? I mean, you can have a prayer counselor in person at church, and you can have an online prayer counselor for your online services. Even if you do the on demand, you can figure out different ways to have the prayer counselors. So I guess my question to you is, how have you, John, built new teams for, how have you reconfigured the volunteer world, and how are you supporting those volunteers, since you can't quite, have the Wednesday night in-person leaders meeting or equivalent, or, before the service, we're going to have a time of prayer and encouragement. You have to be more creative. So talk about the volunteers at Life Church.
Yeah. So, in an ordinary pandemic,
well,
that sounds so strange.
You joke about the pandemic being a once in a lifetime. Hey, that's once in our lifetime. But these pandemics are not new to God. I mean, as we've all read our Bible this year, the word pestilence and pandemic and all these things are similar, have jumped off the pages to us. It's like, well, I never saw that before. I guess we're not so unusual after all. So God has worked through many pandemics. A few he miraculously delivers from, and a few he protects the land of Goshen while it happens everywhere else. But more often, God brought people through. So let's talk about how God is bringing.
Yeah. So picking up on that, heading into COVID, we were set up for success as far as having networks of volunteers. We started creating digital roles right away. The curveball, and this is what when I say we, myself, my wife, the board of directors, what we're still trying to figure out our band is the complexity of, you have, for lack of a better term, a mutiny, or, your paid staff that decide to go in a different direction, and they don't all announce it. That it was a very bizarre thing from my point of view to not understand what was going on. And so that kind of gutted our leadership of those areas. And so on top of trying to do virtual church, on-site church, suddenly all the leaders of those different volunteer teams are gone, and they're communicating on social media a message counter to what God's called us to do here. And so the complexity is, how do you figure out who's in the boat and who's jumped ship, for lack of a better term? How do you round up the people who say they're on the boat, but you haven't heard from them, seen them in months? And then you have spooked sheep who are the green lighters. They're like, let's go, we're going to do in person. We'll jump in wherever, but like kids sticking their fingers in the dike, you're plugging leaks. On top of the relational hurt and pain of a segment splitting off. That's where my wife and I marked 20 years in ministry a couple of weeks ago, and I just keep saying this hasn't been the hardest year in ministry. It's been the most complex.
Okay. So
the pandemic I could have done, but when you add in the splitting off, it's just dizzying. So you got people who say they're members of the church. I'm sorry to keep cutting you off.
No.
So people say they're members of the church, but you haven't seen from them. You've reached out to them. And it's just been radio silence. So you're not even sure who you can count on.
I don't want to underestimate the pain or even the shock. Shock is traumatic. That you're experiencing, and that many of your people who are like, boy, what is going on here? The confusion that they're experiencing. I don't want to underestimate that. But let me just say a few things, which you know the story, so you may decide that that's not relevant at all. But those listening, you're not the only one that's experienced points of division at different levels in a church, and confusion over where to go ahead. Now, the big banner of where to go overhead is there are so many people who need Jesus and who are not connected with the church right now that God will certainly use this. Oh, let's use the popular 2020 word pivot, forced pivot for you to say, hey, I've got a new audience, an additional audience, a broader audience that I need you to reach right now that you weren't reaching before. So in terms of the potential for becoming a fully orbed church of Jesus Christ, that potential is there. Now, in terms of who are the players to help get there, let me walk around the circle. So first, anybody that's had a staff uprising, rebellion, division, whatever, I really challenge you to make it a growth time, not just, okay, I spent an hour with God and I really prayed it through and, I worked out, but going deep with friends, with loved ones, how could I have missed this? This brewing that was happening as it bubbled and brewed up, what sensitivities does God need to develop in me about reading people, and what were the unmet needs that I was missing that caused as many people as did to apparently realign. And so don't lose the opportunity to grow profoundly and personally from this time, and to help your lay leaders and your wife and everybody else, your board of directors you've mentioned, all go through a time of significant learning. And as you do, there is a good likelihood that you're going to find occasion to learn new levels of forgiveness. That, where did this anger come from? Where did this, bitterness, where did this, what are these things that are inside of me that are trying to bubble up? Well, the Lord of the universe wants to help your soul be healed in its fullest sense, and that of the people you serve. So don't walk away thinking, all right, yeah, it was last Saturday I forgave everybody and we're moving forward. It's going to be a journey.
Mm-hmm.
But while you're on that journey, you're at the same time trying to rebuild. And frankly, as you do, you're going to be a different person in who you draw, because you now have new scars, but new sensitivities, new heart, new opportunities, new lenses in your eyes. So this is a time to, in essence, say, all right, Lord, not stretching your hands wide and saying, hey, everybody out there, if you're on board, come, but rebuilding one person at a time relationally, and helping them become a disciple maker, and helping them rebuild relationally, and together as a church inviting those, you probably have three groups. You have those who are decided that they're making the shift, those who are decided they're not making the shift, and those who are in the middle that haven't made up their minds. And so of those who have decided that Life Church is the journey they want to take, and those who are undecided, very intentionally don't do a mass thing. Well, yes, do mass events, but relationally try to connect one after another in new and deeper ways, and to ask people, what their part in the new journey, in the healing journey, what they need, and what they can do as they process the lessons that God has taught them through it. Yes, they're looking to you, John Herron, our pastor, to give spiritual direction. But if that spiritual direction right now focuses on dealing with the emotions of lament and forgiveness and anger and confusion, that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to know how to help people come closer to Jesus in casting all their cares and pains upon him, and your pains as well. So let me stop and invite you to respond, and let's imagine what the next steps in the path that you are taking or could be.
Yeah. No, you're spot on, Dr. Bird. And I think we've done as best a good job as we can with walking through some of the stages of grief at a macro level. Like I brought in my own Christian counselor to speak on stage one Sunday, and that was a powerful morning. And then took time to really press into the topic of forgiveness a couple Sundays ago. So I don't know if that's part Holy Spirit, part intuitiveness. So no, you're exactly on the right track. I'm trying to figure out, how do you love the people who are A, completely on board, and then how do you love the people who B, they're not sure what's going on and they're kind of quiet? And how do you pray for and love the people who misunderstand you and are going in a new direction? And so it's been a sanctifying process in my life and my wife's life. and we just really care deeply about this church. So we don't want, I mean, we're human, so we're going to make mistakes, but coming through this healing phase and getting back on mission, we just don't want to screw it up, if that makes sense. And it's like, I don't have that book that says in the middle of a global pandemic and you happen to have all your staff take off and try to start a church down the street, here's what you do. It's like that's why this is so helpful, even to hear your guidance and to go, okay, those are some things we've done, and then, oh, there's some things we probably should layer on top too. So all I'll just say is, yeah, I'm tracking with you.
It's going to be messy for a while, and you want to see a clear path. And, you know, as long as there's a clear path to Jesus, people can hang on, and that you're helping them with whatever pain because of the split or just the pandemic or anything else in life. If you're helping them grow in their discipleship, then they can journey with you as you see the clarity for what the next steps are as a church. But ultimately, I think you and every church are going to end up saying, okay, this is who we are right now. If we could launch a church with just us and do it all over again, what would it look like? You know, what would the launch events be? How would we get the word out? What are the needs that Jesus can speak to that he could speak through our church? How is our calling for 2021? What are the nuances of our mission in how it's distinct from tens of thousands of other churches? That last question is not an easy one, and probably won't be the first one that you land on. But going on the journey together, a lot of times God shows you from within. You referenced Liquid Church before. The needs to the ministry to people with special needs began simply when there was one family in this small nucleus group that had special needs in their one of their children, and the pastor talking with the parents and saying, you know, how can our church serve you, and how can your situation, God has brought you here, how can God use this, you know, 2 Corinthians chapter 1 style, that in my pain, in my experience, in my whatever, God uses that to comfort and help other people. How can we serve you in a way that would serve others like you? And they were just like, wow, you know, most churches have held us at a distance or pretended to ignore us. And so from that grew a ministry that not only began to attract the friends of that family, but soon became just a beacon of light that the people in the neighborhood, you know, special need parents with special needs kids and others would say, you know, hey, I got to tell you about this church that I go to and what they do. And they do a Friday night out where the millennials in the church watch all of our kids, and my husband and I can go on a date, and we haven't gone on a date in a long time. And we're just, you know, what kind of church does that? Well, it's a church that takes Jesus' mission seriously, but it all started with what God had brought in your midst. So the question is, as you're reconforming, to look around and say, all right, what has God brought to us? What, you know, the Moses question, what is it that's in your hand, Moses? It's a staff. Okay, let me show you what you can do with the staff.
And that's so wild, Dr. Bird, because, you know, I'm very open with our church that I see a counselor, and that's been a really good thing for a lot of folks, you know, giving them permission to see a counselor. And in my last counseling session a couple weeks ago, that's exactly what he brought up, was part of the healing process through this trauma is asking, okay, what does God want to do now, looking forward? And how have you changed as a person? How is the church body changing? And what does that look like going forward? And so it's just interesting how it's parallel to exactly what you're saying too.
Well, that may be the Holy Spirit. And John, and then I have to wind up. But you're a man of enough not only integrity, but lack of insecurity that you can take the church on the journey with you towards your healing, and in the process, many people will be able to relate to you and say, I too am going on a journey of healing with you as you're sharing what you're learning as well. So I don't want to discount the pain that you've gone through and that you still will, but at the same time, this is the core in which God works, and he is not caught by surprise, and he is not unable to work in all you've gone through for his glory and the populating of heaven and the making people on earth more like Jesus. So let's check in on another time, and but in the meantime, hopefully those who have been listening in have gone on your journey with you in yet another way of them asking many of these questions about their journeys.
Feel like you should be billing me now for psychiatric counseling here. This has been so helpful. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. Well,
remember that the book, How to Break Growth Barriers, which you and I talked about earlier by Carl George and myself, 2/3 of the book is not about how to break growth barriers. It's about what is going on inside of you as a leader. And what are the messages that you're hearing, and what are the dreams that you're having, and are they healthy? And so that's another tool that God could use to help in the process. That's not psychological so much as it is just understanding who God is, how he works, and how he wants to grow his church.